Do we want God to judge us based on our accent or the language we speak? Sometimes we make judgments on people based on these things. Is that how we want God to judge us? The point that Jesus is trying to make here is that he wants us to really seriously consider how we look at others. And recognize what's important in how we look at others. I ran across an article in a bulletin a couple of months ago. Talks about a story of let me just read this. I think it'll be clear. A doctor entered the hospital in a hurry after being called in for an urgent surgery. He answered the call ASAP, changed his clothes, and went directly to the surgery wing. He found the boy's father pacing in the hall waiting for the doctor. On seeing him, the dad yelled, "Why did you take all this time to come? Don't you know that my son's life is in danger? Don't you have any sense of responsibility?" The doctor smiled and said, "I'm sorry. I wasn't in the hospital and I came as fast as I could after receiving the call. And now please remain calm and I will do my work." Calm down? What if it was your son that was in this room right now? Would you calm down? If your son died, how would you act? The doctor smiled again and replied, "I would say what Job said in the Bible, from dust we came and from dust we return. Blessed be the name of our Lord." Doctors cannot give or prolong life. Go and intercede with God for your son. We'll do our best for him by God's grace. Father mumbled, "Giving advice when we're not troubled is so easy." The surgery took several hours, after which the doctor came out pleased. "Thank goodness your son will be okay." Then, without waiting for the father's reply, he went on his way quickly and saying over his shoulder, "If you have any questions, ask the nurse." The father turned to the nurse and demanded, "Why is he so arrogant? He couldn't have waited a few minutes so I could ask about my son's condition?" The nurse answered, "His son died yesterday. He was at the funeral when we called him about your son's emergency. Now that he saved your son's life, he left to complete burying his son." How many times do we make judgments about what people's motives are, what people's actions are, based when we don't know everything that's going on? Paul writes to us in Romans 14:10, "But why do you judge your brother? Or why do you show contempt for your brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ." I think this is the point that Jesus is trying to make. We need to be showing mercy when we make judgments about others. We truly need to understand that what he means when he says not to judge. I think what he's saying is not to condemn. Without knowing everything, also recognize it's God's role ultimately to be the ultimate judge. And that's his place to decide someone's ultimate fate. It's not ours. Any thoughts or comments before we go on to the next couple of verses? Notice what Jesus, yes, Jerry. Sometimes we are quick to make a judgment about someone, about how it is that they're dressed or how it is we don't know the situation of everything. I'm sure you were glad that that doctor showed up as quick as he did. Yeah. It's easy for us, I think, to, especially when we're frustrated and when we're hurt and when we're troubled, to lash out. That doesn't make it right. God expects us to be considerate of everyone. Let's look at verses 3 through 5. Why do you see the speck that's in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when there is a log in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. What's Jesus trying to tell us here in this context of judging? It tells us to examine ourselves. It's really, really, I think each and every one of us is really, really good at finding those specks in someone else's eye. We can see others' flaws pretty quickly, can't we? But we tend to overlook our own flaws. Jesus uses the absurdity from the speck to the log or to the beam. Something very big to something very small. We have a way of justifying all sorts of things in our own mind. And yet we find fault with others continually. Yes, Joanne. We find a way, don't we, to forgive our own flaws ourselves way easier than we find ways to forgive someone else's flaws. Notice what Jesus says about people that do this in verse 5. What's he call them? Hypocrites. How many of us are guilty of this? Or have been guilty of this? This is something that Jesus wants us to understand and recognize, that we have to work on our own lives always. We need to think about this in our relationships with one another. How many of us in our relationship with our families can easily see the faults of our family members, and yet we don't consider our own. You know, my sisters would be a lot easier to get along with if they just would, or, you know, my wife's tough to live with because she, or how about Brother Chris, you know, he's a nice guy, but man, he just really, or then we go to the point, well, I have my own faults, but his are so much worse. Jesus is telling us that when we do these things, when we think these things, when we act this way, that we're being hypocrites. That's not how it is that we as children of God should be. Yes, Christopher.
I think
What is the purpose of removing a speck from someone else's life? What's our motive behind that? Yes, Cynthia. That's what it should be, to help them be more righteous and more godly. A lot of times, what is our motive instead of that? That's exactly, to make yourself feel better. You know, when I can point out how bad my wife is, makes me feel good because I'm so much better than she is. Well, that's not the point. Jesus is telling us that's not how this is done. What's he tell us to do first? Remove the plank from our own eye. Why? So we can see clearly. When we have problems with sin in our lives, we cannot, Jesus says, see clearly to help someone else. If we have problems with anger and haven't gotten that under control, why would we think we can help someone else with their problems of anger? Or you pick whatever it is that you want. Why is it that we think that we can help others when we can't even help ourselves? Why would we expect anyone to accept help from us if we can't work on the sins in our own lives? And then, once that's done, when it comes to helping others out with their specks, their small thing, we should be seeing clear, and it should not be to make ourselves feel better. I can look how good I am at being a speck remover. That's not the point. Yes, John. that's what I think it's important for us to recognize, that we can help one another. But the motive is to help one another obtain that home in heaven. That motive is to help one another be truly children of God. If we are not working toward that, if our motive is to make ourselves feel better, if our motive is to knock someone down so that it makes us, we build ourselves up that way, that's not how it works. Jesus is telling us when we do that, that we are hypocrites. We're not doing this right. We're judging in a way that we should not. We are judging others in a way and in a manner that we shouldn't. And notice that this is how God's going to judge us, however it is that we judge others. He expects us to show mercy. He expects us to give people the benefit of the doubt. He expects that of us if we ever have any idea at all that God will show mercy to us. This next verse, verse 6, is one that I guess perplexed me, why it was here for a long time. Notice what it says here, just as Jesus is finishing talking about these planks or beams in our own eye, and the speck in our brother's eye. But he says, do not give to dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you. I think what Jesus is saying here in this context, I think this passage is taken out of context a lot as well, but within this context, what he's saying is, when it comes to us trying to help one another, sometimes that help is going to be received and sometimes it's not. Notice here, we're called on to actually make a judgment right here about our effort, and how it is that sometimes those efforts are going to be like throwing what's holy to dogs or throwing pearls out to the hogs. We need to make a judgment about that. Sometimes people's lives are going to be willing to accept our efforts to help, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes, Eric, never mind. They made it in. Sometimes people are going to be willing to that. And a lot of times we look at this and we categorize, well, people that are not children of God, that are not Christians, sometimes they don't want to listen and don't want to understand. In fact, many times that happens. I think this also, in this context, I think Jesus is talking about children of God as well. We may all have scars from times when we've tried to help someone and they've turned on us, attacked us. Even when we do everything exactly right, when our motives are pure, when we have tried to live our lives and get the sin out of our own lives, and when we see a brother or sister struggling with something and we would like to help them, sometimes that help is not wanted. Jesus wants us to recognize that. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to help. It just means that sometimes it won't be accepted. And I think we need to consider that from the perspective of those that we try to help from time to time, and then how about those that are coming to help us? Do we always treat them with the respect that they deserve? Or do we turn and attack them when all their motive is for our best interest. If someone points something out to you in your life that needs to be adjusted and changed because of their care and their concern for your soul, how do you react? How do I react? Jesus wants us to think about these things. Jesus wants us to have this attitude as part of our lives in order to truly be children of God. So, before we judge other people, we need to think about how it is that we want to be judged, in particular by God. The standard that God is going to use, part of that includes how it is that we treat others, how it is that we act toward others. Jesus wants us to look at ourselves. He wants us to get sin out of our lives. He wants us to be the kind of people, become the kind of people that can help others. But first, that takes us working on ourselves. And when we go to help others, we need to make sure we're not doing this to try to build ourselves up, to tear someone else down. We're there to build them up so that they can be truly citizens in God's kingdom. Any thoughts or comments on this before we go on? Yes, Emily. And it's all interrelated, isn't it? Our relationship with God, our relationship with one another, our relationship with everyone in the world. Jesus expects us to treat everyone with mercy, treat everyone with the care and concern that He treats. Every single soul is created by our God. And every single soul is important to Him. And we need to make sure that they're important to us as well. Christopher.
It says your job is not to judge. Your job is
And when we say not to judge, we need to remember that that's not the same as accepting sin. Sometimes people want to say, don't judge me, when they want to do whatever it is that they want to and not follow God's law and to act in a way that's contrary to what He's told us how we should act. That's not what Jesus is saying. What Jesus is saying is that we need to be merciful. We need to be understanding. We need to get sin out of our own lives so that we can help others get sin out of their lives. We make judgments all the time about things, but we're not ultimately in control of where someone's final destiny is. That's up to God. But we can and should want to help everyone be the kind of people they should be to be children of God. Because if we don't, we're going to be held accountable for what we don't do as well. And God expects us to be his lights. He tells us, Jesus told us just a few paragraphs ago that we need to be the light of the world, the salt of the earth. Our influence needs to be there. And that light is not from ourselves, but it's from him, reflecting his glory and his purity and his righteousness. And it goes back to the Beatitudes. And blessed is the poor in spirit, the one that recognizes and understands that without God we are hopeless. And when we come to that conclusion about ourselves, and we work on changing our lives to be more like what he wants us to be, as Jesus said there at the end of chapter 5, that we need to be perfect like the Heavenly Father's perfect. That's what we strive for and work for. Well, part of being like the Father is having a care and concern for everyone, not knocking others down to make ourselves feel better. It's not about myself. It's not about me. It's about living for God, for Jesus. It's about our lives being given over to him. We are way farther along in time than what I thought we'd be at this point. By the way, if we don't finish up with this section of Scripture, we'll pick up here next week as well. I think there's some time left the way that the material is for the last couple of lessons, that we have some opportunities to cover all of chapter 7 without having to skip over anything. Well, let's look now in verses, I guess it would be 7 through let's go ahead and just read 7 through 12. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks and the one who seeks finds. And to the one who knocks it will be opened. Or which one of you, if his son asks for him for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a serpent? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? And whatever you wish others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Notice what Jesus is talking about here in verses 7 and 8. He really is talking about asking, seeking, and knocking, isn't he? What does that bring to mind? What's the first thing that you think of when you read that? Prayer. Jesus is talking to us and teaching us here about the disposition of God toward us asking him for things. Jesus wants us and is telling us that we should have an active, vibrant prayer life. That's what he wants us to. It's not just about asking. He's talking about it's more than just asking. It's seeking. It's knocking. It's actively having a prayer life. Jesus is trying to tell us and encourage us that prayer is effective and useful, and it's worth our time and it's worth our effort. Does anybody else get anything else from those couple of verses? Yes, Joanne. Yes. It's important for us, I think Jesus, this is so important for us to see, to accomplish what it is that we want to accomplish for him. It takes His strength. It takes God's help. He wants us to recognize and understand we cannot do this on our own. We can't do it without Him. But He is there to help us. I find that this next section, we'll circle back to that here in just a minute, but look at what he says in verses 9 through 11. He's talking about parents. If your child asks you for bread, how many of you give them a stone? When it comes to food, how useful is a stone? Useless, isn't it? Now, there may be, in fact, there are certain uses for stones. None of them have to do with nutrition. I guess maybe as a weapon as you're hunting something to eat, but that's really not what Jesus is talking about. And also, Jesus talks about then if you ask for a fish, not only is it, how many of you are going to give him a serpent? Not only is the serpent useless as far as food, but it could be harmful. How many of us as parents want to provide for us, for our children, useless things or harmful things? Parents don't. Now, are there parents that don't do a very good job of providing useful things and harmless things and good things for their children? Yes, there are parents that are horrible at it. In fact, every one of us in this room that's a parent has failed at providing for our children everything that they need every time. That's Jesus' point. If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? Yes, Marcia. As parents, we recognize sometimes what our children ask for is not what's best for them. And we provide for them what it is that they need. When it comes to food, it's not always cookies or ice cream. Here, probably 6 months or a year ago, I asked Joseph Jeter what his favorite food was. Much to Daniel's surprise, he told me broccoli. And in the next breath, and donuts. A diet of just broccoli and donuts is probably not the best thing for anyone either. And if they, like me, you lean really heavy toward the donuts. As parents, we know what our children need for nutrition, and we do what we can to provide for them, to encourage them to eat what's good for them, even when it's not what they want. Jesus' point is notice how much better the Heavenly Father who is truly good, who knows exactly what it is that we need, will provide for us what it is that we need, what's good for us. And notice what he's saying there. knock, ask, seek. As children, we probably all went and snuck that cookie because we knew if we asked mom or dad, they'd tell us no. That wasn't the best thing for us. How many of us think we know what's best for us when we don't ask God? Think about what problems you have, what concerns you have right now. What is it that you really have going on in your life? Are we asking God to help us with that? God is telling us, I'm here for you. Jesus is telling us, just ask, seek, knock. That door will be open for you. The door that needs to be open for you will be opened. We've got to do it. Why are you not? When you have trouble about judging others, why aren't you asking your Father to help you with this? When we have trouble with turning the other cheek, or going the second mile, or seeking first the kingdom, why aren't we asking God to help us with it? Because He will. Yes. And I think it implies too that God is going to answer us. He may not give us the answer we want. In fact, we can be fairly certain that there are times when His answer to us is different than what we expect. Certainly, Paul talks about that in 2 Corinthians when he asked God to remove his thorn in the flesh. And God didn't. Because it was not what Paul needed. Sometimes we'll ask for things of God that's not. Recognize that God is going to, in the parameters of what is good and what is just and what is right, He's going to answer our prayers and give us exactly what we're asking for within those parameters. So with that, beyond that, He's going to give us what it is that we need. We have run out of time this morning. We certainly didn't cover what I wanted to. We'll pick up here and talk a little bit more about this next week before we jump into the next section in chapter 7. Appreciate your attention this morning. Thank you.